Giorgio Cafiero, you are the CEO and founder of Gulf State Analytics, a geopolitical risk consultancy based in Washington, D.C. You recently published an interesting article in the Cradle titled Defying US Caesar Act. China admits Syria into BRI, China's Belt and Road Initiative. Giorgio, for starters, what is the Belt and Road Initiative about, and how is it different from China's ancient Silk Road?
Well, first of all, Kavork, thank you so much for having me on your show. It's really an honor to be here with you and to talk about Syria's role in BRI. To let your viewers know a little bit about the historical context, and as you just mentioned, this ancient Silk Road. If we go back about 2,000 years in history, China had trade routes that went through a number of areas that constitute modern day Central Asian countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and these trade routes linked China to Europe. Mm-hmm. And of course, the trade went both ways, east and west. Then fast forward about 2,000 years, and in 2013, China's head of state was delivering a speech in Kazakhstan where he announced Belt and Road Initiative. This was first, many people referred to it much more as One Belt, One Road, or OBOR. And this is the most ambitious trade corridor, by far the largest trade project in the history of the world. Mm-hmm. This project, BRI, is about a belt corridor. It's called the Belt, and it's an on-land trade route linking China to numerous regions, including Central Asia, the Middle East, and also Europe. Then there is One Road, and we have to be careful because it's actually it's a set of maritime trade routes. It's not literally a road, but it connects China to many ports throughout Southeast Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, Africa, and even South America, as well as European countries too. And in total, BRI is really about making China's economic connectivity with dozens and dozens of countries much more effective. Mm-hmm. This takes on so many different forms. We're talking about roads, energy pipelines, ports, logistics hubs. In many cases, this is about refurbishing and expanding such existing trade infrastructure. In other cases, this is about building this infrastructure from scratch. And obviously, there are countless geopolitical implications of BRI. At the end of the day, this is about China as a rising power, asserting its economic and geopolitical influence in the world. And this is such an ambitious project. The goal is nothing short of making China the center of the 21st century's global economy. Mm-hmm. Now, I hope later on in this discussion, we can talk about many of the controversial aspects and some of the challenges that the Chinese are going to face. But I hope that is a good overview of what BRI is.
Giorgio, so if I want to summarize this in few words, this is a trade project in order to improve the infrastructure of the different member states that are joining this initiative of China. And it's a win-win, let's say, more or less situation between these different member countries or those who join the initiative, which will give China on the long term, on the long run, a more geopolitical leverage over the regions that covers this initiative, right? And out of curiosity, is Taiwan part of this initiative or not? I mean, I know Taiwan is part of China, but there is some special case for Taiwan as well.
To confess, I actually do not know specifically the status of Taiwan in BRI. I would imagine, obviously, the Chinese are trying to bring Taiwan into this, especially long term. But because of the political factors involved, I'm not sure if Taiwan has signed up for this.
Yeah, I think it would be very interesting to check this, because one of the reasons why the United States is pushing for, let's say, separatism or try to promote independence of Taiwan is to block the access of China into the international waters, right? So it would be interesting to check this. But if we come back a little bit into Syria again, now Syria is officially a member or joined the BRI. And you argued in your article that this will deepen its cooperation and economic ties to other countries in the BRI, the Syrian relations, right? And enable it to circumvent the effects of the harsh American sanctions on the country. Now, if some of the BRI countries have close ties with Washington, wouldn't this be an obstacle in itself for Syria to deal with these countries?
Absolutely. As I'm sure your viewers are well aware, since Donald Trump's presidency, Syria has been targeted by the US sanctions known as the Caesar Act. Throughout Biden's presidency, the US has continued to impose these wide-ranging sanctions on Syria. And you bring up a very good point. Inside BRI, there are many countries that are close US allies, US partners, even some members of NATO belong to BRI, for example. And while we can talk a lot about the decline of US hegemony in the world, the reality is, at least at this point in time, the US continues to be the dominant actor in the international financial system. So when the United States imposes sanctions on a country such as Syria, that will obviously do a lot to cut such a country off from the global economy. And as a consequence of the US imposing sanctions on Syria, there are many countries that are not doing business with Syria. That is going to remain the reality as long as the US continues imposing Caesar Act on Syria. Now, having said that, I think there are a number of countries which will be testing the United States, and specifically the Biden administration, maybe the next administration, to see how intense the United States is with enforcement of the Caesar Act. I think some countries, perhaps some companies around the world, believe that the US will become more lax with the Caesar Act down the road. There's also ways for trade to happen unofficially and to mark products as if they're coming out from other countries. And this can enable Syria to benefit from the BRI without these countries they're cooperating with getting punished by the US Treasury Department. I think it's useful to look at the ways in which China and Iran have been trading throughout this period of so-called US maximum pressure. I think that's probably going to offer the Syrians some examples and some lessons they can learn about how to benefit from a deeper partnership and to benefit from deeper economic ties to China while also being targeted by the Caesar Act. At the same time, I think China is going to test the United States when it comes to Iran and Syria. Obviously, as we know, China has limited its trade with Iran to some real serious extents as a consequence of US sanctions on Iran. China doesn't always thumb its nose at US sanctions regimes, but the Chinese do that in some cases. And with China becoming such a dominant economic player in the world, I do think we're going to see Beijing thumb its nose at US sanctions probably more and more with time to come. And certainly the case of China-Syria relations are going to be really important to monitor.
I think it's very interesting to monitor two things now after Syria's joining the initiative. Number one, how much China is going to challenge the US sanctions when it comes to Syria. And the second thing is in the US itself, because the United States, despite the harsh sanctions, it seems that the Biden administration is turning a blind eye into at least two countries in the Middle East when they are dealing with Syria, and namely Jordan and the UAE. Like, the king of Jordan met with Biden, and the UAE also were having delegations in the US that they have to deal with Syria at the end of the day, and they want to do business, and their economies, especially the Jordanian one, was severely harmed because of the sanctions on Syria, because both countries have a big border as well and trade relations. But when we come back again into Syria, you said in your article, and I'm going to quote your article, Syria represents a corridor to the Mediterranean Sea which bypasses the Suez Canal and revives ancient trade routes connecting China to the African and European continents. Quote end. Now, can't Beijing pursue the same goal through Jordan and Israel, or does China prefer Syria over Israel when it comes to bypassing the Suez Canal and reaching to Africa?
That's an excellent question. And as we know, Israel definitely is an important node in China's BRI. Israeli technology, Israeli ports, so on and so forth, are ones that China is optimistic about how they can contribute to the success of BRI, especially when it comes to the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. Your question about whether or not there's a preference, long term, I think that's it might be a little tough to tell. Obviously, Israel is not in the same situation that Syria is in. There's much more stability and economic growth going on in Israel compared to Syria for reasons that are extremely obvious. But, long term, I think China wants to benefit from having both Israel as well as Syria serving as nodes in the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is not about picking one over the other. China is very ambitious. They want to have a lot of influence over Israel and over Syria. I think probably from Beijing's perspective, it's unfortunate that Syria and Israel are, countries that have technically been enemies of each other since 1948. That has to do with the messy politics of the Middle East. And I think China wants to try to sort of look past a lot of that and try to promote a future in which there's more connectivity between all these countries within the BRI context.
Mm-hmm. But when we talk about the obstacles, let's say, in when it comes to the Syrian membership in the BRI, and for the process of during the process of reconstruction that didn't start yet officially or efficiently yet in Syria, but there is going to be some reconstruction projects in Syria, right? And the Syrian leadership views China as a key investor and partner to rebuild the country. However, the lack of stability, as you mentioned, and the few remaining pockets of ISIS and al-Nusra in the country, how does China plan to overcome the security obstacles, especially with the presence of thousands of Chinese Uighur jihadists fighting alongside Al-Qaeda in Idlib?
These are excellent questions. And I would begin by pointing out that I think things might move a little more slowly than the Syrian government would like everyone to think. Given all of these factors that you bring up, there are many obstacles to a much deeper economic partnership between China and Syria. The Chinese will probably move more cautiously in Syria than the Syrian government would like. And I think it serves the talking points of the Syrian government to sort of exaggerate the extent to which the Chinese will be coming in, and to make it seem like China's money will be coming in much sooner and in much greater quantities. That can help the Assad regime project an image of being much less isolated than it actually is. Having said that, China looks to Syria, the long-term picture. Yes, all of these factors you mentioned create huge obstacles right now, but the Chinese are looking ahead to 10, 20, 30 years down the road when maybe there will be more stability in Syria, and it will be much easier for the Chinese to benefit from Syrian ports and trade infrastructure. But yeah, given the while the level of violence in Syria is nothing compared to what it was a number of years ago, there continues to be warfare in the country. There still is a presence of ISIS and other armed extremist groups. and that will definitely cause the Chinese to move with some caution.
Giorgio, Syria or the official, let's say, stance of Syria always, when it comes to Israel, there is an official line that normalization of relations is not possible during these circumstances, and the Israelis have to return the Golan Heights first before engaging into peace talks. But there is a bigger elephant, in my opinion, in the room, which is Turkey. And Turkey, again, occupies northern Syria. There is a big belt, and also their troops are in Idlib, and they refuse to leave Syria till the moment, despite the agreements between Erdogan and President Putin. Now, with the economic opportunities that the BRI presents to Middle Eastern countries, do you believe the conflicting sides, especially Turkey and Syria, may be motivated to compromise thanks to the Chinese initiative, something they refused to do in the past years?
I am of the opinion, and there are many people who disagree with me, but nonetheless, my opinion is that the way the conflict in Syria is headed is that at some point, I'm not sure it's going to be tomorrow or anytime soon, but I think at some point, part of the end game is going to entail a rapprochement between Damascus and Ankara. I think the Assad government will eventually have its embassy reopened in Ankara, and I think Turkey's embassy in Damascus is going to reopen. And I think there's going to have to be some compromises that the two sides make. I think perhaps there's going to have to be an end to Turkey's presence in Idlib that permits Damascus to reassert control of all of northwestern Syria in exchange for the Syrian government making concessions to Turkey vis-a-vis the YPG and taking Turkey's security concerns about this PKK-linked group into greater consideration. And yes, I do think that China is going to be a country that has a huge incentive to see to it that Turkey and Syria eventually reconcile. And if/when that happens, China's Belt and Road Initiative will be able to benefit from such a development whenever that is going to happen.
Actually, maybe some people disagree with you, but me and you are on the same page in this regard. I think reconciliation or rapprochement with Turkey is important. You share 600 to 800 kilometers of borders with Turkey, and I think the player that has the biggest negative effect on the Syrian situation was Turkey when they opened the borders with Syria between 2012 and till the moment. So at the end of the day, I think there will be a certain deal between Damascus and Ankara. And even Assad didn't rule out that possibility. He said that if I have to shake hands with Erdogan, I will feel disgusted, but the interest of the people of Syria is over the table. So he will, in my opinion, he will do it. And in exchange for security arrangements regarding the YPG and the SDF and other Kurdish militias in the north and the east. Now, in your article again, I'm quoting because you mentioned brilliant ideas in your article, and you, I think, interviewed also Joshua Landes, and he said, I quote, "China can play an important role in weakening the impact of the Caesar sanctions." Joshua Landes was also a guest on Syrian Analysis. The followers know him well. While Iran succeeded in partially breaking the economic siege thanks to the strategic agreement with China, how is Syria gonna make it when at least 50% of its oil fields are still in the hand of the United States? What can Syria present and give in this initiative?
Well, yeah, and these practical questions are very important to keep in mind. It's one thing to talk about on paper what it means for Syria to join the BRI, but all of these factors that you're mentioning have to be kept in mind, and we have to be realistic about these obstacles to a deeper partnership between Syria and China. And the U.S. role is obviously important. The United States doesn't want to see China make the Caesar Act ineffective or sort of cancel the impact of the Caesar Act. And as long as the United States is occupying this part of Syria, it will deprive Damascus of access to many of the resources that will make Syria important to China. I think the Chinese understand right now that they're not going to be able to start importing Syrian gas and oil for these obvious reasons. But again, this brings me back to a point I made earlier. When officials in Beijing are looking at the situation in Syria, they're in this for the long haul. And I think as China's leadership sees the U.S. decreasing its commitments to the Middle East, not to say the U.S. is getting out of the Middle East anytime soon, but when we look at U.S. position in Iraq, what happened in Afghanistan last year, the view is that the U.S. is in general moving away from the Middle East, at least gradually, and probably there's a view that the U.S. occupation and military presence in parts of Syria will not last forever. And certainly China would be more confident about moving forward with its relationship with Syria when we're at a point down the line when the US ceases to be an occupier in the country.
I think the former ambassador of the US in Syria, Robert Ford, also mentioned what you said, that the Americans do not have a long-term strategy in Syria and they're gonna withdraw sooner or later. And he was advising the Kurds to sit on a same table with the Damascus government. But I think the withdrawal, also Joshua Landes mentioned this on his interview on Syriana analysis, that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was very, there was a blowback, right, against Biden for his decision to withdraw and the chaos that followed the withdrawal. So maybe the decision will be delayed to withdraw from Syria. Maybe a new administration. Let's see, after 2 years, right? In 2 years there is an election in the US. But if we come back in Syria, and my last question is, because I ask this question a lot, and I myself, I don't know, because the Chinese aren't making any statements in this regard, but we know for sure there are at least 5,000 Uighur jihadists in Idlib. Those are the men, well armed, well trained, and they are very good fighters. And they have their families with them, and they're having kids, and the kids are going into training camps when they're 7 and 8 years old. And these kids are being indoctrinated and they're becoming jihadists when they become 12. They're participating in fighting against the Syrian government. Does China have a policy, a strategy to contain at least this threat? Because in my opinion, this is not only the Syrian problem, it's also a Chinese problem, right?
Yeah, so as we've been talking about today, in the Syria-China relationship, BRI and these economic issues are really important, but there is a counterterrorism dimension to the Damascus-Beijing relationship. And your question about these militant Uyghurs who are in anti-Assad groups on the ground in Syria goes to the heart of this counterterrorism dimension to the relationship between Syria and China. Yeah, frankly, the leadership in China is really scared about the potential for these radicalized Uyghurs to either return to China or maybe return or come to countries in Central Asia where there are many Chinese nationals and many Chinese interests. And they're worried about how these battle-hardened militants could spill blood and fuel instability in ways that harm Chinese citizens and Chinese interests. China thinks that this is one of the reasons to cooperate with the Syrian government and to support Assad's regime. They want collaboration with governments around the world that see this threat from Uyghur extremists the same way that Beijing does. And there are certainly many synergies between Damascus and Beijing when talking about issues such as extremism and terrorism. Obviously, the Western perspective is that China is guilty of a genocide in Xinjiang. And when people in the West discuss Uyghur issues, the focus is definitely on the Chinese government's human rights violations in Western China, not as much focus on real threats that extremists from Xinjiang do pose to China and some other countries in the Middle East and Central Asia. But, as far as the Assad regime is concerned, these Western efforts to try to create wedges between China and Muslim majority countries need to be opposed. And Syria joins pretty much all Arab countries in terms of being very supportive of Chinese policies vis-a-vis the Uyghurs.
Even Saudi Arabia is in support of
absolutely.
China.
I think there's one country in the Arab world that we need to make a partial exception for, and that is Qatar. We can say that Qatar has not joined other Arab countries in terms of supporting China's policies in Xinjiang, but pretty much all of the other Arab League members have come out to praise China, not just to be silent or indifferent toward it, but to outright express support for Chinese policies in Xinjiang that Western governments say amount to genocide. Mm-hmm. There's a lot to say about that, but it's very relevant in the case of Syria, where, as you mentioned, there definitely are Uyghur militants on the ground that both the governments in Damascus and Beijing are very, very worried about.
Yeah, in 2016, when the Syrian government was trying to recapture the eastern neighborhoods of Aleppo and they besieged the eastern neighborhoods, they were the Uyghurs who came from Idlib and conducted car bombs and terrorist attacks in order to reopen the route from Idlib into the eastern neighborhoods. And unfortunately, they were embedded with Syrian, let's say, militants back then, and they were called freedom fighters. But for the BRI, in my opinion, it's a very important initiative. It will connect different countries, and it will increase the economic interests of these different member countries of the BRI. And when there are more economic interests, there will be less of conflicts between these countries and decreased levels of tensions between these countries that could bring more stability in the region. I'm just speculating. Let's hope it would be that way. Giorgio Cafiero, thank you very much for being my guest on Syriana Analysis. You are the CEO and founder of Gulf State Analytics, a geopolitical risk consultancy based in Washington, D.C. It was a pleasure to host you and listen to your insights on this issue. I really appreciate it.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much.